Let me just briefly introduce the panel members, and I'm sure perhaps they'll say a bit more about themselves in a minute. On your far left is Sam Berry. He's Emeritus Professor of Genetics at University College London. He's been a former president of lots of biological societies, like the Linnaean Society, the British Ecological Society, the European Ecological Federation, the Mammal Society, and so on. He's also been a member, in fact I think he was a member for about 20 years, of the General Synod of the Church of England. So he has a good knowledge both of ecological things and religious things that I hope he'll be able to share his wisdom with us. He's written a number of books on that. Next to him on my right, your left, is Hilary Marlow, who has a PhD in theology. She did a first degree in sociology, and she's particularly interested in environmental concerns. She's worked with an organisation called the Rocha for many years. I think maybe was even a founding member of it, or associated with the founding members, so she's been with them from the beginning. And currently she's a lecturer in the Faculty of Divinity here in Cambridge. So on the right here, first of all, I have to apologise actually that Barny Dickson, who was going to be sitting here to the right of me, couldn't come because he had a family illness, I'm afraid, just at the last minute, and that was just yesterday afternoon. So Professor Jan Borsima has stepped in very generously, and I'm very pleased he has, because he's also got a lot of interest in ecological things. He was trained as a biologist in Holland, and then he did a degree in theology, and he's had a lot of involvement both with that academic side of religion and theology, religion and ecology, but also he was Secretary General of the Council for the Environment at the Ministry of Housing in the Netherlands, so he's had a lot of practical experience too. He's currently a professor at the, well, I call it the Free University, but you can tell me the proper pronunciation in Dutch. And then finally, Simon Stuart, on the right here, is chair of the Species Survival Commission of the International Union for Conservation of Nature. He's come from Bath, but he's on his way to a meeting in Doha, isn't it? Doha, sorry, in Doha, tomorrow, to do with species conservation. So he spent quite a lot of time in the field in East Africa, working on amphibians. He did his degree and PhD here in Cambridge, so he too has a lot of knowledge of ecological issues and how amphibians are declining at the moment and extinctions. So quite a lot of interest and knowledge on this topic. So is it okay, Sam, if I start with you and we'll move from left to right? So 5 minutes or so.
And the chairman is Professor Bob White, who is Professor of Geophysics in this university. Don't say any more. I was Professor of Genetics at University College London, as you've been told, for something like 25 years. I was a sort of geneticist who actually looked at real populations rather than worked in the laboratory. I spent much of my research life chasing mice on small islands to find out something about their genetics, which has no theology attached to it as far as I know. But I've also been a Christian since my latter days at school. I've never found any conflict between my Christian faith and my science, my biology. And I've tried to bring them together, not to make them sort of fit into each other, but to actually ask questions when issues arise from scientific questions and Christian-type questions. I was, as Bob said, I've been chairman of all sorts of things when I'm young. I'm now survived from the Neolithic age. I was reminiscing earlier this year, the year I took tripos here was the first year that women and men had been allowed to sit in the same lecture hall. Before that, you know, all these women, you could put you off when you're writing essays. But that dates me, as it were. Now I hope that in these years, since then, I haven't wasted time completely in trying to make sense of both my science and my faith. and bring them together. I'm not sure what spirituality is. Biodiversity, as I'm sure will come out, is really rather a complicated concept. But no doubt somebody will tell me what all these things are, and I look forward to hearing what they're going to tell me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, as Bob White said, I teach here and have researched here, and my particular interest is in looking at the relationship between human beings and the rest of the natural world, the non-human creation you might want to call it, in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. And I've explored in various ways in which that relationship is talked of. And as I've done so, coming both with obviously a real interest in the Old Testament, but also a passion for natural history. I'm not a professional like some of the others on the panel, but my interest in the natural world has been there all my adult life. And I've found that as I've kind of explored these topics, there's all sorts of questions have been raised in my mind, and I'm just going to throw some of them out here. So start with questions, and then you can pick up on any of them that interest you. There are questions to do with purpose. Why are we here is kind of the big question, but why all the rest of the species in the world? Why this amazing diversity of species? And even in the Old Testament, which you might perhaps think you know anything about, is a book about God's dealings with people. Actually, it's not. There's a myriad of other creatures named and involved and part of the text that you read. So why this amazing diversity, which we are really only on the edge of understanding the extent of it? Why are we here? Why is everything else here? And the second question that concerns me is to do with value and how we value life, how we value inanimate, natural objects, the natural world in general. What value does the non-human have to us, and intrinsically, or does it have any intrinsic value? And again, I've seen in the text of the Old Testament that question surfacing in various ways and getting answered in different ways. And the third question that I've come up against is the whole one of what we might call the ethical, the moral questions. How should we relate to the world that we live in? What are the boundaries around behaviour and how we should regard it? In what sense is the natural world sacred? Some people would say it's divine, but in what sense, I don't think actually that is not my reading of it, but in what sense is it sacred? Is it special, or isn't it? Is it just something at our disposal? And perhaps more difficult to answer question, does the non-human creation relate to God in any way? And if so, how? And are there any clues to understanding that? And then finally, the sense that this is more a reflection that in the Old Testament, there's very much a tension between what I call desolation and hope. And desolation is what we might call devastation, destruction, the kind of things that we hear about, that we see happening to the natural world. And yet alongside that desolation, there's also this profound sense of hope that things can be different.
Thank you, Hilary. Yeah. Yes, thank you, Bob, for being here and giving me the opportunity to share some thoughts. I'm teaching in the Netherlands, and that is, I think, especially the Western part, a secular society. And I think most of my students are secular. I think that the Dutch students, by and large, in the environmental sciences, are for 95% secular. So what I try to do is just make a convincing case that there is at least a reason for an ethical stance on biological conservation.
Of course, it's also a common cause, because after the Rio UN conference in '92, we are, so to speak, all in this together. Because the first objective is of the conventional biological diversity is the conservation of biological diversity. So, and that means every species, if you read the convention. And there's a clear need to do that. If you look at the figures, just read the Guardian this week. I'm not sure you've done it all, but we are losing the world species, and it's going in a rapid pace. Especially not the phenomenon of extinction is strange, but that's a normal phenomenon. But the pace is extraordinary, and also our own responsibility for. In most of the cases, we are the cause. So there is a common cause. There is a need for saving biodiversity, but it's also, in a sense, an abstract problem. So if you look at these pictures, nice pictures, but I think no one of you have ever seen one of the species photographed here, like who've ever seen the coupri, the species of deer, very rare. So I think, in a sense, you're reading this as a death announcement of some remote, unknown guy in Siberia. It's not really touching you. It's not moving us, in a sense. I think that is a problem. But also a problem is that we don't know much about biodiversity. We know 1.5 million species are classified, but there might be 3 to 50 million. So, in a sense, some species are becoming extinct without even a name, or without even knowing that they have existed, which is rather bizarre, in a sense. It's also the figures that are incomplete that bother us. For instance, if you look at the figures of the IUCN, the red list of threat species, I just singled out the amphibians, and then you find out that in 2003 there were 175 amphibian species threatened, out of a total of 5,700, and only a year later there were 1,770. And that's just because they did a large survey. And all of a sudden, the number of threatened species was tenfold. So what do we make up of all the other data? I think it's extremely difficult. So what to do? I think it's a good thing to add value to nature. And all the calculations we made amount to enormous sums. The cost of biodiversity loss, for instance, is calculated to be about $1 billion US. And I think it's good to make those sums. And it's also good to further the idea of ecosystem services to express the importance of biodiversity. But I don't think it will bring us far enough. I also think there is no real need, ecologically speaking, for every species to survive. I think it's sad to say, but it looks like if some species can be missed, and some species are more important than others. So I think to build up a real case for conserving biodiversity, and to achieve the new goal of stop the loss at 2020, we certainly need an ethical stance. And for me, that is that there is a fundamental right for a species to exist. And secondly, that you must have really good reasons to expel another species from the earth, or as a Christian you could say, a fellow creature from the earth. And the practical consequences of this are that you, apart from going the direction of ecosystem services and valuing nature in financial terms and ecological terms, And you should also focus on the reasons of the decline. So we should focus more on the necessity of all human activities that are basically the reason for extinction. So we should reverse the burden of proof instead of trying to make a case for a special animal and the importance of a special species on that particular place or that small ecosystem. We should also question the human activity, and I think that is underestimated at the moment. That's what I want to say.
Thank you very much. I've been interested in the natural world, the environment, species, ecosystems from when I was very, very small, before I can remember. And I've always had a twofold interest, I think. One is in the facts and the figures. How many are they, where are they, why do they live as they do? What you might call the science, and that's been my career. But the other has been, which has never left me, has been a sense of wonder, the amazement of what's out there, the beauty, the sounds, the diversity of it all. I think it was always inevitable that I would become a biologist, and I did, and I was an undergraduate here. But I also, after a sort of long search, I think, the way to put it, I became a Christian here as an undergraduate. And I've lived my adult life as both a scientist and a Christian. And that has been extremely important in trying to hold together those twin passions I have for the facts and the figures, but also for the wonder, and actually trying to hold it together in a single view. And the Christian faith has enabled me to do that. Now, as Hans was just saying, we are living in a time of unprecedented change. My job that I now have, I oversee the official IUCN Register of Threatened Species, the official listing of species. I don't actually do any work on it anymore, I just oversee it, and a very large number of people around the world are working on it. The head office that runs it is here in Cambridge. And the underlying data shows that the current extinction rate is between 100 and 1,000 times the background rate. So we have enormously elevated, as human beings, we have enormously elevated the extinction rate through our various activities. This information is becoming clearer, and we're broadening it out. You know, as Hans pointed out, we talked Disney did interview years ago, and we keep on adding more taxonomic groups. And the science is putting the information before the policymakers. And there's another group of work, and I don't work on myself, but a lot of people have been working on, which is the economics of it all. What's the impact of this species loss on people? What's the cost of saving species and ecosystems versus the cost of losing it? And the answer is very clear. The cost of losing is much, much more expensive than the cost of conserving. And yet still, we don't see the political action we need. And I think it's increasingly clear that science and economics on their own do not lead to behavioral change. They lead to awareness. The politicians that went to Copenhagen, they believe the science, they believe the economics, they know that stuff, but they don't take action. And they don't take action because they fundamentally don't believe that society is willing to bear the costs in terms of change lifestyles. They fundamentally don't believe that, and they're probably right too. Society probably isn't willing to bear those costs. And I think that's where religion comes into it, because we need values. We need, if we're going to bring about change so we live in this world in a sustainable way, we will need societies based on values, and where people are living for values that go beyond the money and balancing their own budgets and stuff like that. And those costs will need to fall preeminently in the richer countries, because the poorer countries cannot carry the costs, which is where they're being born at the moment. So these are all hugely complex, fundamentally political issues in which a religious dimension, I think, a spiritual dimension is essential if we're going to see progress. I'm not going to make it on the science and the economics alone.
Well, thank you very much. Just before we throw it open to everybody, I'm going to ask each panel member if they'd like to ask one comment, one question maybe. But actually, since I'm in the chair, I have the privilege that I can ask one first. So I thought I'd just throw the cat among the pigeons, really, because I've heard everybody as a subtext say that species loss is a bad thing. But with I'm a geologist, as Sam said, with my geological hat on, I know that 65 million years ago, 95% of all species went extinct overnight. That's when the dinosaurs went extinct. And if that hadn't have happened, then it's quite arguable that mammals wouldn't have arisen and we wouldn't be here. So is extinction necessarily a bad thing? It's what the Earth seems to do regularly. Does anybody want to answer that?
It's the pace.
Well, it's partly the pace, but it's partly the cause as well. So as a Christian, I believe that the non-human life, and indeed the human life as well, exists for a purpose, and that is to display and point us to the glory of God. That's what it exists for. And so it is not our right, in my view, to remove species that were not going to be removed if we hadn't done it. If they're going extinct naturally, that's a different thing, but to be honest, we can't even detect natural extinction these days because the human impact on the planet is so massive that you can't detect any natural extinction. I've never come across one in my entire career. All extinctions going on now are human caused. And that, I think, is something we don't have a right to do.
Anybody else?
Can I just take up this point of value, and how do you actually value what is happening in the natural world? You've had the report of extinctions quoted from a report came out this last week. I haven't seen the report. I've only read the newspaper comments. And the newspaper I read talked about puffins disappearing from the south of England. It talked about choughs disappearing. It talked about white-tailed eagles disappearing from the east of England. These are partially human orientated. The puffins, almost certainly probably not, is a temperature thing, which again is a human thing. All these things are connected together. What we need to do, and I see this very much as from my wearing a religious hat, is to be absolutely ruthless with the truth. And if we start allowing wool to be pulled over our eyes by whoever it is, we're going to go down a dicey path. Let's make sure we get the facts right, the cause of the extinction, and the cost of the extinction, and not forget, and Simon mentioned this, the awe that is there in the natural world. And it's more than a specifically religious awe. Julian Huxley, Max Nicholson, Richard Dawkins they all talk about the wonders of the natural world. And somehow we've got to balance this awe with the value.
Any question? Anybody else want to ask a question?
Yeah, I'm taking the stance of a more secular person. If you consider a human species as just a species, like every other species, as some evolutionary people do, then we are a species that are the cause of extinction by our technique and so on of other species. So we are the big volcano explosion or the meteorite coming from heaven that kills all other species, and that gives way to a better species. So all problems evaporate in the evolutionary timeline, so to speak. So I'm arguing it is a matter of quality of our existence and of quality of our humanity to preserve fellow creatures. It can't be argued from another reason, because then you end up in some evolutionary void, I think.
Good. Any other last comments from the panel or questions? Well, maybe I'll think of some. But now we've got a couple of microphones. I think there's one over there and one over here. So if you'd like to ask a question, why don't you just put your hand up and then the microphone will appear close to you. Thank Okay, so let's start this. Oh, sorry, we'll go next to you. Yeah. Speak, if you speak into the microphone, everybody can hear.
I want to ask about the Hindu mythology about reincarnation, whether that is a form of evolution.
I won't take the risk.
I think you'd have problems with the genes once they got into space and outer space again. They might be what Richard Dawkins called memes, but memes don't have a real existence in the scientific world as I understand it. I think that's as far as I'd go. I wouldn't want to put evolution and Hindu ideas together, personally.
John, go back, yeah.
What I meant was that if I want to become a human being, I have to do good deeds. If not, I go back to the very primitive form of life like amoeba and then progress back to. So that cycle of existence and extinction, I wanted you scientists to have any opinion on, that's all.
The thing that I find, and I don't think this answers your question, but it's just an observation I'll make, the thing that strikes me is that, in a way, the kind of ecological damage that we are doing to the world, if some people have sort of said, you know, there's going to be some great sort of cataclysmic destruction, in the end I feel it's the amoeba and lower life forms that are actually going to survive that, and it will be human beings that don't. So, you know, maybe it's not quite as straightforward as we might like to think. And I suppose for me, yes, in one sense, as humans, we are sort of, you know, we can have a hierarchical view. We are, you know, we're the only species capable of altering environments other than our own. We're the only species capable of bringing about the kind of destruction that we see globally. And yet, in many ways, that's what's contributed to a lot of the problems that we have, that we've almost perhaps tried to behave as if we were gods or godlike with respect to the natural world. And that, for me, that I'm wanting to see an understanding that perhaps sees us as fellow creatures rather than as in this kind of position of hierarchical superiority. That's,
Thank you. There's another question a bit further forward here.
I'm wondering, so the concept of I guess adding value or placing value on a lot of these species so that we can understand and make some sort of assessment as to whether or not we should preserve or not preserve is very important. But we're raised and grew up in the societies where we have a real disconnect between where we live and how we work and nature. And it's only growing, you know, more so, the divide between human existence, at least, and nature, you know, with the advent of technology. And so how do you then raise a generation, or even this current generation, come up with a valuation system if most people don't have any concept of nature?
That's a good question.
I think that's an excellent question. I think that's one of the main issues, that people don't know the species they are supposed to conserve, let alone they love the species, or they value the species in whatever sense in their personal lives. I'm always talking about species that when they extinct, like for instance the grey auk, and I don't know if any of you know the grey auk or have ever seen the grey auk. I think there must be some that noticed that it was a British bird that went extinct. It's the only bird species that went extinct over the last 500 years in Europe. So the mass extinction was before that period. But still, when we visit the Orkneys, for instance, we think of the Orkneys as a pristine wilderness, more or less, untouched, and there's a species missing. And do we really miss that species? I think that puzzles me. And I think unless we have the feeling that we are really that the loss of species really affect the quality of our life, I think we are in trouble. And I think with biodiversity, that is a big problem. At the moment, here in the UK, the grey squirrel is replacing the indigenous red squirrel. But the kids that grew up here, they like to love the grey squirrel instead of the red one. And what's the point? What's the point?
Thanks. It's very true, I think, that society, urbanized, suburbanized society is increasingly dislocated from nature. I think that's a fact. And not just in the Western world, but increasingly in parts of the developing world as well. And this gives rise to all sorts of things. It leads often within the conservation movement to a very romanticized and unrealistic notion of nature sometimes. And people who grew up in the countryside know nature red in tooth and claw much better than urbanized people do, whose view is David Attenborough view or BBC Natural History Unit view or whatever it might be. I think this is a huge problem. I think it comes down to the education system, partly getting kids out when they're young to appreciate natural history, appreciate the countryside. I think these are all things that we can do. But lying behind this, though, I think there is a schism, even within the conservation community, about values. Part of the conservation community would say, yes, we should place economic values on things, yes, we should do that to strengthen the arguments. But in the end, species don't have to earn their way in order to have a right to exist. They have a right to exist intrinsically. And the other half of the conservation community would say, no, it's really about people. And if the species aren't valuable, then actually, in the end, it's sad as they go. It's not the big deal. The big deal is whether we are preserving a planet in which it's safe for human life. And I would actually take the former view. I'm totally comfortable and use the economic arguments, but I wouldn't want the world just to be driven by economic arguments alone.
Actually, Simon just raised an important point. Are we just one species among 1.5 million or however many you want to name, or are we somehow special? And the answer, of course, is that we're both. We depend on the natural world, but we can do something about it. We are both a part of nature and apart from nature. How do we get that balance between being animals? Well, let's face it, many people just live as animals, seeing how much they can accumulate, how much they can copulate and all the rest of it. And how much do we live as more than animals? And what does it mean to live more than animals? And that, of course, is the religious question. What does it mean to be truly human?
Thanks. We'll have a question from the front.
There are some rather nasty creatures that we've made the deliberate decision to get rid of, such as the smallpox virus, the polio virus, and the guinea worm. Now, should we just say let them go, or should we, as we might be doing, try and keep small samples alive in safe places? How do you feel about that?
Thank you. Of course, some of us are old enough to remember that we got rid of the smallpox virus, but recently 2 people died, didn't they, from it, because it escaped, not recently, about 10 years ago, from one of those repositories. Yeah. Now, who'd like to answer that?
I have no scruples about anyone who can get rid of the Scottish midge as soon as they can.
I think it's a tricky question, because it comes down to this valuation, and what do you value, and how do you value it? Are you valuing it for what reasons? And I mean, I grow vegetables on my allotment, and I wage war every year with slugs. But I have slight problems about the way I kill them, and I want to do it in the best possible way. And yet, there's a bit of me thinks actually that's ridiculous. Either you want rid of them or you don't, you know. And it's a tricky one, and I don't have an answer as to where you draw the line.
You could transport them to your neighbour's patch. Or you can drown them in beer. You can drown them in beer. That's a very nice way to go.
Probably was not.
I think what you say is a good example of what I meant with that we have to ask questions about the necessity of human activities. So you must have come up with a good reason to expel a fellow creature from the earth. It might be for smallpox we had that reason, at least to keep them detained forever. So there is a basic position that the species have a right to exist unless there is a very good reason. And you gave some examples, I think.
Justice
Actually, I'm just going to add to don't mind, Bob, just one thing. In the real world, we're faced with very difficult decisions. There's one, I'm heading off to the Convention on International Trade and Endangered Species meeting that happens every 2 years in Doha and Qatar. It actually starts today, but I'm not getting there till tomorrow. But the one of the issues is, will Tanzania and Zambia be allowed to trade in ivory? And you know, there can be massive discussions about that. I'm not going to say what I think the rights and wrongs are of that particular one. But what I can tell you is you cannot allow elephants to carry on increasing. And human beings also who live in Africa. It can't happen. And some hard decisions have to be taken. In many cases, elephants have to be culled. These are poor countries. If they've done it legally and sustainably, shouldn't they have a right to benefit from that income? I think and actually, I don't have a problem with that. I think if it's managed well, I don't have a problem with people selling ivory. So I think there are tough questions like that. That's perhaps a more charismatic species than the smallpox virus, but it is an example of the fact that not everything gets on well with humans.
Maybe a question primarily directed to our professor of the Hebrew Bible. At the end of the first creation story, mankind is given dominion over creation, and I've come across the suggestion really that actually dominion may not be the best translation of the Hebrew, and I would like to know what you feel would be the most appropriate, or maybe a range of translations. And I suppose the second part of my question based on that would be, to what degree can the Judeo-Christian tradition be regarded as being responsible for promoting the idea that actually human beings are not fellow creatures, but are somehow sort of sit at the top of the creation tree?
Thank you, that's a very good question. And in a way, it was that kind of question that provoked me on my course of research. To go to the translation dominion, I mean, in a way, the words that it's translated as, the problem is we need to get behind the meaning of whatever word we use. What we mean by dominion nowadays can easily veer into sort of domination, and the idea that it's a kind of a harsh kind of grinding something down. I don't think that, certainly for the ancient world, the Hebrew word carried that sense. I think it has more to do with how a human being farms his land, sort of brings about sort of agricultural land out of wilderness and so on, the sort of thing I do in my allotment, if you like. In one sense, I'm exercising dominion when I dig out weeds like I was this morning. So you know, it can become a very sort of emotive sense that actually, and this is the take that some people have taken, very well-known article, which I'm sure you're probably aware of, by somebody called Lynn White in the 1960s, where he actually accused the Judeo-Christian tradition of being responsible for exploiting the earth and contributing to environmental problems. Now, a number of theologians have shown that actually it's not just the Judeo-Christian tradition that can take the blame for that, but other societies have also exploited their land, their goods, just as much as the Western, largely Christian world has. And that actually as I went on and hopefully showed in my research, the text of the Old Testament has a much more nuanced and often positive view of human interaction with the non-human. And it's not a case of domination in the sense of legitimising that kind of exploitation. It's a relational interaction, a kind of a three-way relationship, if you like, between God, human beings, and the non-human. And that relationship is either a good one or a bad one, and often the relationship between human beings and the non-human, in the biblical text as well as in today, was one that broke down. Sorry.
I think in the course of history, Christianity took over the Greek idea of a linear hierarchy. And together with the dominion tax, it turns out to be rather harsh to nature. And I think I'm quite critical about the way Christians dealt with nature in the past. I think the whole idea of conquering nature was very Christian and Western. And conquering nature as such, so not just using nature for whatever ends, but also as such it was a good thing to domesticate and to tame the wild and the nature and so on. So I think we have to make quite a turn in the Western world to return to some kind of intrinsic value of nature, what was not akin to our Western culture for centuries. And even now, I think the whole idea of intrinsic value is rather new. It doesn't exist in the 19th century. Take, for instance, Darwin. The default attitude was to kill every animal and then to study it. He's complaining in his diaries about that he had to use a geological hammer to crush the skull of the Patagonian duck. So that's the way, that's the default attitude, I think, for a long time. So we have to reinvent, I think, the Christian value of nature. And I think the Old Testament offers a lot, but we have to overcome our history and be a bit more, show a bit more humility, I think.
Just to go back to dominion, that command or statement, or whatever you call it, is in the context of human beings made in God's image, which is that which differentiates us from the whole of the rest of the animal creation. You've got to put those two things together. What does it mean to be in God's image? It means to exercise the sort of relationship which God has towards his creation, and we've got to do it. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing is, I think Christianity can indeed take a lot of flack for the way we have looked after nature, but there's also a long Christian tradition, particularly in the Benedictine tradition, of stewardship. And the stewardship and the despotic relationship go parallel. And it comes back to what I was saying earlier about being apart from nature and a part of nature. We've got to put them together, and how we put them together is the tricky question.
So that's another question. Just the hand with the first.
Okay.
We can hear, it's okay.
Bit technical. I'm very interested to hear more from Simon, is that right? Okay, thanks. Sorry, I didn't have my notes in front of me. I'm really interested in hearing a little bit more from you about finding a better balance between science and economics on the one hand and religion on the other. The other night I went to the talk on loss of biodiversity and what does it cost. And I'm very interested that we're all talking here about value and in dollar terms, which I think, to my mind, I've been thinking about this for quite some time, that we express so many things environmentally, also in relation to climate change, in relation to the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals, in terms of how much does it cost, and is that a good idea purely on that basis. And one of the things that I would then maybe be interested to hear from the rest of the panel is to throw that to Christian Scientists as a challenge. There's been a lot of effort on apologia over the last 30 years, which I find extraordinary, given that a lot of the thinking on science and religion was done and dusted in the 18th century. We're still banging on about whether or not there's a God. And bringing it to the specifics, what sorts of things might happen at CITES or need to happen at meetings like CITES to get the balance that you're talking about, given that, as you say, policymakers won't make the decisions because they don't believe consumers will bear the costs.
Well, goodness, I sort of posed that hoping someone would answer it for me. Yeah, but I think it is the key issue. I think one of the problems is that in an increasingly in a world where information is much more easily shared, and where the holding of sort of power elites and governments keeping information secret to enable them to take decisions without much comeback. That's all changing in the internet age and the information age that we work in. And the result is that by and large, decision-making processes are increasingly dependent on public opinion and less dependent on expert scientific processes that used to drive them. So if you take the climate change negotiations or the biodiversity negotiations that are going on this year, they are all science sort of based, policy-based, economic-based discussions where very clever people get into rooms and have endless negotiations, they try and thrash stuff out. But the problem is the politicians are listening less and less to that stuff. They're actually listening more and more to public opinion and what's on so-and-so's blog and this sort of stuff. And so we have an increasing dislocation between the formal processes for taking decisions, especially international decisions, which is what many of these things require, and what actually drives politicians. And so that's one of the reasons why I raised the question earlier about how do we link the sort of science world and the economic world and then the values-based world beyond the money. How do we link it to make it happen? And the answer is we don't know because we haven't done it. And but I think it is partly a question of really mobilizing the religions around the world. And so Hilary and I, for instance, have been involved in this organization, Russia, which is a Christian environmental organization. And part of our job is really to get the church to wake up to its calling, which I think a number of Hansa said. The actual Christian history on this stuff is not good. So we can't claim that it is. But actually, not only is it not good, it also wasn't biblical. Wasn't true to biblical teaching itself. And so it's a question of bringing the church back to its calling in terms of creation care. So that's our little bit to try and build public support for some pretty radical measures that are needed. But it's going to require many other groups in society to do that in order to have this impact. You said you went to hear a talk on economics and biodiversity. Was that by Kavan Sukhdev or from this big study that's going on at the moment?
It was at the Judge Institute 3 days ago.
Okay.
So it's Cambridge Conservation Initiative.
Okay, there's a huge study going on at the moment called TEED, which is the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. And it's going to come up, it's basically the Stern report for biodiversity and ecosystems. And the Stern report on economics alone didn't get us the way we needed to get on climate change, and neither will that report. It will help, But on its own, I think we know the political process isn't going to move if they don't see public opinion behind the policy options that need to be implemented.
I'll just make a comment on the way through, since you mentioned the Stern report. One of the interesting things about that report, which came out a couple of years ago, it was an economics report about climate change, and he said that it's worth doing something about climate change now, because if we spend 1% now, we'll save ourselves 20% down the line in 10 years or 20 years' time. So it's just naked self-interest. And actually, I think that might be the way that everybody will respond. If you do something because it's in your own self-interest to do it, and clearly preserving biodiversity is one such, doing something about climate change is one such, then people are more likely to do it, actually, whatever the moral or ethical reasons are. Hilary.
I was going to say something that perhaps is an alternative perspective to that. And that was just, is this whole idea of the values other than economic, sort of what we might call aesthetic or spiritual or whatever valuation. And in a way, I suppose that, you know, people with some kind of religious background are perhaps more comfortable with thinking about those kind of valuations, and perhaps kind of scientists are much more geared up to think in scientific terms, economists in monetary terms and so on. But what was really interesting is a report that was published about 3 or 4 years ago by the Environment Agency, which some of you may have come across. They asked 50 environmentalists, conservation biologists, scientists of various kinds in this country to, they asked 25 individuals to list the 50 things that will save the planet, and they ranked them in order. And the report went through sort of from the bottom up, and the top one on the list was change of light bulbs, in other words, energy use. But number 2 in the list, this report said, encouraged faith communities, faith leaders to motivate their people to take action on this, to get behind this, to regard it as a high priority. So even amongst the world of scientists who perhaps haven't always thought in terms of the religions having anything to contribute, and they're perhaps more the kind of aesthetic, spiritual valuation of biodiversity, there's this sense that actually there needs to be that incorporation. So maybe it's not just going to be all economics. Maybe.
Okay, could you bring that one? There's a question at the front first, but I think that microphone works better.
Thank you. Does this work? Yes, good. Well, an observation on the remark you made about the appeal by Rocha for the Church to wake up to the environmental question. I mean, an observation is simply that, at least in its higher echelon, the Church of England now does seem to be the Green Party at prayer, not the Conservative Party at prayer anymore. But my questions relate to, first of all, the references throughout the Old Testament, and I really direct this one at you probably, the references throughout the Old Testament in the prophets and elsewhere, to the strong relationship between human conduct according to the law and in obedience to God, and the consequences for the fruitfulness of the land. There are so many warnings that the land will be barren and the cattle will die and so on. I wondered what you could draw out of that that's applicable to us today. And second, if I could ask the former president of the Linnaean Society about that rather intriguing episode in the Genesis story of creation, where God invites Adam to name all the creatures. It's always struck me as a very interesting episode, and I wonder if from your particular perspective you could say anything about what that tells us about the relationship between man, species, and the naming of them.
Yes, well, thank you very much for your observation about this sort of link that there is in very many of, particularly the prophetic texts of the Old Testament, the well-being of the land being tied to the people's obedience or lack of it. And there's very clearly set out throughout the whole Old Testament, this sense that actually this three-way relationship again, that obedience to God on behalf of the people and the well-being of the land that they live in are inextricably linked. And there's a particularly telling text that sums that up in the book of Hosea, which talks about the people having forgotten God, and as a result, in their own society, they've had an outbreak of stealing, lying, adultery, murder, bloodshed, in other words, societal disintegration. And then it goes on and says, therefore, the land mourns, the birds of the sea, the birds of the air, the fish of the sea are perishing. And again, there's that really clear link between sort of human relationship, spiritual understanding, society, and the natural world. And now, if we move sort of 2.5 millennia on to our today's society, we perhaps don't see it quite as clearly, starkly as cause and effect, that if we disobey God, therefore the crops fail. Other parts of the world do see it that clearly. But what we can draw from that as Westerners is the sense that actually actions have consequences. Our actions have consequences beyond those that we might immediately quantify. And of course that's the whole point of environmental degradation, that what we've done and people in previous generations have done, sometimes innocently, sometimes in a cold and calculating way, has knock-on effects and has an ongoing kind of, produces ongoing effects that are often devastating. And the second thing that I think we can draw from it, and in particular in some of the prophets, their outcry is against social injustice, and it's often as a kind of, that's one of the sins that they condemn people for, the breakdown of care for the poor and the marginalised. And of course, what we see today is almost like a reversal of that, or the other side of the coin from that actually we do see the poor and the marginalised suffering because of lack of harvest and crops failing and so on. But actually it's not because they have necessarily themselves gone wrong, it's actually because of what we in the West have done. And I think that's a very profound moral challenge that we have to face, the fact that our actions as wealthy Westerners have a knock-on effect into the crops and the livelihood and in terms of social justice in other parts of the world. And that's what I would see the prophetic message of the Old Testament addressing to our society today.
Sam, naming.
Naming things. It shows, of course, that taxonomy is the eldest profession. And when you're naming something, it means you're studying them. It's a mandate for science, if you like, for ecology. But also, further on in the chapter, Adam is given the job of tending the garden. And the word, I'm told, I'm subject to the theologians here, means to actually nurture the garden, to care for it. Now, both the naming and the nurturing are all part of our relationships. We're not separate from nature. We're dependent on nature. But we have a relationship which is different to, let's say, bees and primroses and whatever. We have a dominion, and it should be a responsible dominion. And I think that part of the naming is linked in with that dominion.
Could I just add something on this tending the garden? In fact, in many English Bible translations, it's translated as to till and to keep, or to till and to. The Hebrew words actually mean can be equally well translated to serve and to preserve, and that's quite a powerful kind of that's parable of how we should be actually living in the world today.
I'm also a theologian in a sense. I graduated in theology and I studied the creation stories. And I think it's, to me, it's a little more complicated with the man relationship to nature. I think after the fall, man was never given again the authority over the whole earth. I think I think after the fall we see that splitting up nature in a domesticated part, which is drawn into the government with the laws, and the so-called wild nature. And the wild nature has two faces. One face would be of awe and wonder, and the lilies in the field and so on, and the ravens that are fed by the Lord. And at the other side, the hostile kind, the nature as a punishment and a hostile environment, the desert and the drought and so on, and the chaos. I think so. So there's not just one picture of nature in the Old Testament. And as to the naming, I think it's very interesting that the whole story is about seeking a partner. The story starts with the man is without a partner, and then all the animals are brought to Adam, apparently to look for a partner. And then he's naming the animals, and in the end, he doesn't find a partner. So somehow there's a fundamental relationship between man and the nature world, at least in the paradise situation. But in the end, there is a divide between man and animals, because he can't find there a proper partner, one that is an ever cannot help opposite from him, of the same flesh.
I think we'll just take one last question on to the formal panel, and there'll be a chance to chat informally afterwards. So, I saw a hand right in that.
My question was something else, but this naming business, I've always had a tremendous interest in it. I think the name is to know from inside. And in East Africa, for instance, where I was for many years, there are communities there where only the very intimate members of the family actually know the real name of the child. They will have a public name, but they will have a very intimate name, which is only theirs. And I think in the creation story, that is an idea that I like. That when Adam names the creation, it's the fact that he's knowing them from inside. And it's the French verb for connaissance, which is to be born with, to know someone rather than somewhat to know a fact. I think we find that also when, who was it, Moses on top of his mountain asks God, is it Moses or Abraham, who are you? And he says, I am who I am. In other words, from my point of view, God is saying, when you really know me, you won't have need of a name, you will know my name. And at the resurrection story where Jesus meets, the risen Christ meets Mary Magdalene and gives her the name that only he knew, I think it's a very, very deep theological perspective, this naming, and that gets away from all sense of dominion or mastery or I'm in charge because I'm naming you. It's coming into something intimate of man and women and human beings as being intimately part of creation. And that brings me to the question I was going to ask is, how can we value animals or whatever, nature, if we do not value ourselves? And I think that's the big crisis today. That human beings, we do not value our own intrinsic value. And that we have an intrinsic, to take out the terms of one of the panel, we have an intrinsic right to be here as human beings, as a gift of God, if you believe in God, which I don't particularly, but as a gift to creation. We are a blessing. And to go back to the theme of spirituality, I can't define spirituality myself, but if it does exist, I think spirituality is what gives us a sense of our own value as human beings, a sense of our own beauty, and a wonderment, which is sort of like a million miles away from the ideas we have of being human today, i.e. we have to work to be human, we have to work for our right to be here, we have to have a good image, we have to make things, we have to buy things, we have to sell things, we have to own things. It's a million miles away from that intrinsic value that we have as human beings just because we are. And I think once we get in touch with that, then we can get in touch with the intrinsic value of the rest of creation. And then there won't be a debate anymore. It'll just happen. I don't think that was a question, was it?
No, but I couldn't agree with him more. And I think this is quite where religion comes in, where it gives hope. And with some trepidation, I'll take issue with Jan about not having any relationship to the whole of creation. This is exactly what happens, and this is the specific thing about Christianity. The main New Testament commentary on the fall, and the falling out of relationship and all the rest of it, is in Romans 8, where Paul talks about the creation groaning, in other words, getting screwed up, until the revealing of the sons of man, and women, of course. And that is when we are in Christ. In other words, when we realise ourselves as more than being flotsam and jetsam in this world. That there is a place for us, and that is really the Christian message, that's Christian hope.
I do agree with you, and yet what I see is that perhaps we've replaced a sense of intrinsic value with a focus on self. I mean, we live in a very selfish society where people are only concerned about their own individual needs, wants, and so on. And it seems to me that part of recovering intrinsic worth is actually that ability to think beyond the individual need or want, and to think beyond that, to think outwardly instead of inwardly, if you like. And I think that it's only as we do that that we then start to value not just other people, but also other species, the whole of creation.
I also agree, but I'm just going to quickly say something on the species naming thing, but you did as well. We haven't got very far down this task that Adam has given. We really haven't been very good at it. So the catalogue of life has 1.2 or 1.3 million species in it, but we've named more than that, but the names are in such a mess that again, haven't sorted it out. But maybe they're about 1.9 million, but I would say almost definitely they're more than 10 million there. It's a very large number. So naming of species is a God-given science that we have not taken very seriously, I think. I very much agree with what you said about valuing ourselves, because and this is one thing that makes me a little bit uncomfortable about these economic valuation things, like the Stern report, like we're seeing with the Teague study now on biodiversity. I think they are important. I don't think there's anything wrong with them, but they are part of a trend to put a dollar value, usually it's dollars, on everything, on absolutely everything. And this sort of commodification of life, I think, has been deeply dehumanizing. And the whole sort of globalization, homogenization, everything being dominated by big companies rather than small ones, all of this, I think, has not done us any good as humans. And so I do get worried when we start to do that for the rest of life as well. And I think you're right that if we don't value human life as we should, then we actually really don't know what value means beyond money itself.
Well, thank you very much. On that note, I think we'll draw the formal part to a conclusion. I think you'll all be here for a little bit, won't you? If you want to come and chat informally with some people on the panel. There are books outside, some of them written indeed by people sitting beside me here, and all at reduced price. This day was put on by the Faraday Institute, and perhaps I can just remind you that there's another public lecture on the 27th of April at 5:30 in Downing College by Professor Bill Newsom, coming across from the USA, to talk about God, mind and brain, one of the last big frontiers of science, I think. How does brain relate to mind? So that should be a fascinating lecture, and everybody's welcome to that. But perhaps you'll join me in thanking the members of the panel for their time.